Hello, welcome back. This is James Nussbaumer, author of The Master of Everything, a story of mankind in the world of illusion we call life. Here we jump into chapter 15, titled Truth is Our Choice. In this chapter, I will be sharing a horrific and horrifying experience while I was in prison. But first, let's begin by saying freedom can never be gained because you always have it. But it can be impossible for you to perceive this if you see your body is all there is in being yourself. Your body is full of limits. If you look for freedom in a body, you are looking for it where it does not exist. The mind can be made free when it no longer identifies itself as a body, firmly tied to it and sheltered as though the body is the master. But identified with the body, we feel vulnerable to outside influences that dictate and try to rule us, leaving us feeling afraid to act without approval. Expecting more pain and fear in our lives will only allow the ego to take advantage of us by placing blame and becoming defensive. The ego's help will only keep us in the vicious circle we talked about previously, taking us on the ride of around and around as we try to figure out where to get off the insane roller coaster. This keeps us always turning to the ego for peace and security, as though we're constantly asking, when am I going to find it? The more we depend on the ego in this way, the more fearful we get. A Course in Miracles teaches us that the abilities we now possess are only shadows of our real strength. All of our present functions we make divided and open to question and doubt. If we don't realize our present abilities, such as our right-mindedness, we simply will not advance in anything that we pursue. We must realize the opportunities we have in all areas of our lives, or at least realize the step that we're on now at this moment before we can move up to our real potential. The experience of prison has been a reality beyond anything I have ever known before. For me, it required learning a new way of merely being, that is, who I really am in a violent environment. Many times, especially in the beginning, I would feel myself on the edge of panic, trying in my mind to squeeze myself past the steel bars. Screeching and screaming often echoed all around me as I continued scolding myself. My fearful muttering would sound as desperate as I felt. There came a point when I learned to get a grip on myself and quiet my mind and maintain a serene state of being. I became like a zombie much of the time. My mind started turning inward. There was a definite force building inside me that was telling me, "Don't give up." Then my voice would respond by saying to myself, "I can't give up. I have no other place to go." A strength was building inside me like nothing I had ever surrendered to before. As I look back, I am convinced it was the Holy Spirit opening my eyes to a gift I've always had. About the best way I can explain this is to say that my inner joy felt as though I had discovered a wisdom. I continue to learn from it. It is a power that was new to me, and this wisdom seems as if it is finally free to be itself. Only my true self can tap into it, and the wisdom itself is called truth, with a capital T. This wisdom is very simple. It tells me that anything not of truth is not real and therefore must be illusory, made by the ego. Many times, strength is thought to be built on these illusions and fears, but quite the opposite is true. It didn't take long to look fear square in the face when I realized that Belmont Prison's reputation for being a gladiator school was no joke. Everywhere I looked seemed to be kids, young men barely out of high school, and many who had never attended high school, let alone graduated. These young gangsters, literally members of gangs, stood out and ruled the place. I stood out as well, and the few men of my age bracket were often called pops, or old school, or just plain school for short. At this particular prison, the age of 50 was surely old school, and this pop's age bracket was definitely a minority. But there were no senior privileges. Everyone and everything was fair game. The racial mix was 70% black and 30% white, with Hispanic mixed in there somewhere. This set the stage for the gang warfare that was fought daily. Gangs were of a fraternal order that populate prisons all over the country. The unwritten rule at Belmont was that you fell into one of three categories. First were those who either owned or had under their chain of command other weaker inmates who had to earn their way to the level or beyond. Second, there were those fighting their way up the ranks and were considered owned or ruled by another. Lastly, if none of these appealed to you, your only option was that of an independent status. This option was often called traveling alone or being solo, with no protection other than your own solo way of dealing with problems. The inmates, like myself, who traveled solo and wanted no part in gang activity, gradually became aware of one another. One would be able to notice fellow independents who just wanted to be left alone. It would take some time to prove your devoted independent status by not giving in to the gangs and their enticement tactics. Many independents looked out for one another in certain ways and warned others of trouble ahead. An independent has few, if any, friends, and you are cautious in trusting anyone. Each gang basically has its own gladiators who have many responsibilities, and one of those tasks might be to drag an independent into action somehow. This is usually some kind of a recruitment measure or threat to give you a sense of the importance of having protection. Only after a few to several bumps and bruises, if you're lucky, and your own voice being heard strongly enough, does the message get out that you are a waste of their time. This pertains only to a certain degree, but a livable one. However, you are never totally out of the game. They always seem to test you when you least expect it. On a bitter, cold morning just after breakfast, when I least expected having a problem at all, a show of illusory strength was displayed against me while I was walking the prison yard. A blow to the back of my head by a young gladiator slammed me straight to the ground. I didn't know what hit me. The next thing I remember is sitting on a gurney at the infirmary having a blood-spattered gash stitched up. After 16 stitches and a bandaged head, I found myself in segregation, also known as the hole. I would spend 11 days in the hole wondering what the hell happened while an investigation was launched. This was routine and basically was meant to determine which gang I was tied to, if any. It was discovered that a young wannabe gladiator seeking membership into a well-known gang had used me as his prey for initiation. The gangs call this earning your bones for its new members. My thoughts dwelled on the cowardly action of the new gladiator. Unfortunately, much of the world understands strength as being outwardly physically powerful or forceful. But when we have inner strength, we live from truth. In any situation, we have a choice to act from a position of truth or falsehood. If we choose truth, our true essence will be revealed, and our decisions are made from our right mind. Our thinking will sprout from this. We will also see any obstacles from a right-minded point of view. During those 11 days in the hole, only a few weeks prior to my stumbling into A Course in Miracles, I felt as though a part of me was watching over my thoughts. I had experienced this watching over of my feelings and thoughts and decisions even in my childhood. But now in prison and in the hole, I was trying to find my way through my frustration and took this observer of my thoughts a bit deeper. There were no books, magazines, radio, not even a Bible. The hole had a thin foam mattress on the concrete floor, a toilet in the corner, and a solid steel door with a slot near the bottom for a food tray to slide through. Believe me when I say that this type of dark confinement can bring much that has been held inside to the surface. My inward thoughts focused on a world that invents terms and procedures it wishes to be true, usually for the sake of some form of gain, a world that believes it can create its own truths built on its own judgments. I found that if someone convinces me I am untruthful, be it morally or otherwise, he has denied me of my own truth. This then has me living according to his judgment of the way the world is to be. While still in shock at the mere fact of being in prison, I also recognized my own illusions that led me to make decisions for material gain, and I rued the harm this had caused me to cause others. On day 6 in the hole, I heard the sounds of chains dragging along the concrete floor in the hallway outside my cell. The steel door to the cell next to me clanged open. I heard the chains being unlocked around the ankles of another inmate as the guard directed him to enter the cell. After a few hours, my new neighbor was shouting through his food slot to find company in me. I responded to his call. His name was Steve, a white man of 47, and like me, a victim to a gladiator earning his bones. He had been stabbed in the thigh with a shank by a young black man, he went on to tell me. He had just returned from an outside hospital and would remain in the hole while the investigation was performed. Steve and I made some casual conversation through the food slot as he told me about his 6-year prison term for burglary. He had only 10 months remaining and would go back to his job as an automobile mechanic. Steve was helpful to me regarding what I should expect from gang activity, as he was aware that I was just beginning my 10-year term. That fact in itself was constantly haunting me, as was my concern about surviving the decade stretching before me, with an ever-renewing population of angry young gladiators with something to prove. Therefore, I eagerly digested his information with an eye toward my own survival. On day 7 in the hole, the horror continued. I heard an outpouring of enraged shouts, along with the sounds of chains, as yet another inmate was dragged to the hole and thrown into the same cell with Steve. It was quiet next door, as Steve and his new cellmate had no choice but to get acquainted. Alone in my cell, I prayed it would remain that way. I couldn't bear the thought of sharing that tiny hole with another prisoner who would possibly be a young gladiator who could stir up more trouble. A few hours later, I heard strange and unusual crying for help, along with accelerated pounding on the steel door next to me. I recognized the voice as Steve's. The pounding and crying and choking continued, then slowed its pace and finally stopped. I could only hear the commotion due to the concrete wall separating the cells. I lowered myself to the floor, hoping to see a clue through the food slot. Realizing there was trouble, I screamed and screamed for help, louder and louder, through the food slot in the door. 3 guards arrived after several minutes of my shouting. I stuck my arm out of the food slot and pointed to the cell next to me. I was out of breath from yelling. One of the guards opened the door and, realizing an inmate was unconscious and bleeding from the head, he excitedly called for medics. The hallway had many cells lined up in a row, much like you could imagine maybe of death row. It's normally chaotic with insane, vulgar, animalistic sounds echoing off the block walls, a loud, ceaseless, hollow-type sound. That day the hole grew silent. A guard snapped handcuffs onto the new inmate, pushing him into the hallway. Through the food slot in my door, I watched as the young black man fell to the floor only to be dragged away. My initial thoughts were that Steve was hurt bad. Within minutes, medical staff had arrived with a gurney. They spent several minutes in the cell. It was quiet and cold when the gurney left, with Steve's body, his face covered up with a sheet. Steve was dead. The dead man, Steve, age 47, whom I never did actually meet face to face, but had talked with through the food slot in our doors, had been beaten to death in cold blood by a 25-year-old youth. Rumors in the weeks ahead said that the incident was gang-related and racially motivated. Later, I would also discover that Steve was a high-ranking icon in a white supremacy gang. A contract had been put out on Steve's life, which does very often happen in gang wars. The two men should have never been in the same cell together. I was asked a few days later by prison officials to give a statement as to what I heard. However, based on the conversations I had with Steve prior to his death, I knew it was in my best interests not to make a statement at all. I'd also learned that a statement from me wouldn't have carried much weight anyway, being that I was also a prisoner. 5 days later, after 12 days solo, I was released from the hole and declared not guilty of any foul play in the violent attack on myself that had sent me there. Any false strength we conjure up is nothing more than fear masquerading as something powerful. This is created by the ego and bears no likeness to who we truly are. The young inmate desiring a gang membership only provided himself with a false identity he thought that he needed in order to make him feel strong. In reality, this illusion only made him more fearful. We get upset and angry at the world for not being fair, but we project that image and continue to contribute to its inequities. Yes, it's our projection. We are all starving for love that the world is afraid to give us. This brings on violent action as defense because we are so afraid of losing more love. Do you see how the ego creates a never-ending cycle of weakness? The ego believes it is all-powerful until faced head-on with the light we have radiating within us, but we are often afraid to let it shine by being our true self. The ego is afraid the light may shine into its hiding place, which is anchored in misconception. But upon this misconception of self, the world smiles with approval. It guarantees the pathways of the weak are safely kept, and those who walk on them will not escape, nor will they find right-mindedness, let alone eternity or one-minded vision. Of course, I'm not blaming the world for my own mistakes caused by my own lack of vision, but I do know that the world cannot force its images on me any longer. I refuse to accept them. The time has come for me to see exactly who and what I am connected to. I hope you feel by now you are beginning to know me and your true self. When the people of the world have earned their bones to the point where they start questioning the world's fake concepts, then truth will set them free to face the world without fear. A Course in Miracles wants us to learn that the illusory world's purpose is that we arrive without a self, and the world helps us to make one as we go along. So by the time we reach maturity, we have perfected it to meet the world on equal terms, seeing truth as we see fit. This was so with prison officials at Belmont Prison when they decided that the truth would be Steve's death was accident related. That's it for Chapter 15, and we will next session be jumping into Chapter 16. Thank you.